Writing this presentation has made me muse about the history of the Population Studies Centre, which, until it became NIDEA, had endured for 30 years. This was more than 1/3 of my life and half my working life. This longevity raises major themes which fit well with the NIDEA seminar's overall title. So the question is, why was the Population Studies Centre able to be sustained in this way? What were the factors that drove its success? In fact, its existence was longer than this. In the 1970s, Ted Douglas, Ruth Farmer, and James O'Neill all ran demography courses in their core departments. Moreover, Ruth Farmer had set up a population unit in geography, also using parts of that department library grant to buy key books and journals in demography, and she did a very good job. Douglas, Farmer, and O'Neill strongly encouraged me to return to New Zealand from Canada to strengthen demography at that Waikato. In the event, in 1978, the university appointed me Professor of Sociology, but not of demography, as had been hoped. In general, in fact, the commitment of the university to population studies was slow to materialise. It took until 1980 before the Population Studies Centre was formally instituted, and then with parsimonious constraints imposed in particular on funding. Nevertheless, the Population Studies Centre and its successor NIDEA were and continue to be New Zealand's only such centre. Before returning to New Zealand, I had benefited from teaching and research experiences in major overseas centres and reviewing population and development agencies, especially in French West Africa. This knowledge, which I had brought back to New Zealand, shaped my view about the ethos of a centre and helped me to analyse Maori historical data. These experiences have shown me that when establishing a new entity, there are essentially two paths available: set about institution building or set about producing project outputs, although of course the two approaches are not diametrically opposed. Institution building, pardon me 1 second please, emphasizes infrastructure, branding, facilities, mission statements, and so on. By contrast, project orientation demands investment of most available funds into research and analysis. We chose the latter approach. At a theoretical level, the Population Studies Centre approach has a whakapapa back to the actual founding of the Royal Society in 1662, the Bills of Mortality, a sort of primitive life table. In North America and Australia, we tend to see population issues as driven by migration, yet mortality is the real heart of demography. It drove global growth until the 19th century, since when, globally, improved survivorship has been associated with a long-term worldwide fertility decline, starting in the Anglo-settler colonies as it happens. Migration is a minor component of growth, far outrun by natural increase in most quinquennia, yet its marked spikes and churning now perturb the entire demographic system and render analysis problematic. A cross-comparative analysis on the Anglo-settler states in my forthcoming book, Peopling in Development in a Settler Society, Aotearoa 1769 to 2020, demonstrates that this holds true also for the other Anglo-settler colonies. The analysis of mortality has bequeathed to demography basic concepts such as cohorts and survivorship, and has been a general factor in theory building, particularly in mathematical demography. This methodology is very different from the regression-based techniques which dominate in the other social sciences. Thus, life table analysis must be a core course for any student of demography. We also decided to focus on social rather than technical demography. This was reinforced by the appointment in 1995 to the Population Studies Centre of 2 senior staff, Arunachalam Dharmalingam and Sarah Hillcoat Nalatambi. In the late 1990s, Sandra Baxendine was employed as a fellow and worked there for about a decade. Richard Bedford, Natalie Jackson and Jack Pote were directors for varying periods, and others were appointed acting directors of the centre. With Tahu Kukatai, Bedford, Jackson and Pote contributed to prestigious research and centre management, thus enhancing its reputation. The projects brought in research fellows, mainly graduate students, too many to list here, from a number of disciplines with a fair number from overseas. Now, over the 30 years, the Population Studies Centre initiated and successfully completed 5 major tranches of projects, which I'll describe briefly to indicate the strength and breadth of Population Studies Centre activities. All tranches involved numerous researchers, and we published collectively, typically with different lead authors. Numerous smaller projects were also activated, and the senior faculty have all written major analyses that brought prestige to the Population Studies Centre. The International Seminar on Stochastic Projections published an edited monograph in a special edition of the New Zealand Population Review, and Michael Cameron has extended this work. As senior author, Dharmalingam published a monograph on birth interval dynamics. Sarah Hillcoat Nalatambi published a monograph on contraception in Mauritius. At the 100th anniversary of women gaining the vote in Aotearoa, we published Ministry of Women, what is still a unique book, authored by Lisa Davies and peer-reviewed by Prue Hyman, on the history of women's labour force participation from 1893 to 1993. Turning to major tranches, the 1980s were given over to the United Nations Economic and Social Country Monograph Series on each Pacific country. In this, New Zealand was partially funded by the Population Division of the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, and partly by ad hoc means. New Zealand alone, among participating countries, published 2 volumes and was unique in having little public financial support. The Australian volume, for example, was supported by the Commonwealth of Australia. These 2 Aotearoa volumes remain the most comprehensive overview of New Zealand population and encompass an extraordinary wide range of topics. For example, Law and Population by Sylvia Cartwright and Environment by Charles Crothers. Ruth Farmer's long chapter on migration received plaudits from Kingsley Davis, the internationally eminent social demographer. The 1990s were devoted to a fertility survey, New Zealand's only proportionate probability survey field in this field. It had clip-ons based on disproportionate segments. This allowed oversampling of Maori and funded from Te Puni Kōkiri, and of residents the Midland Regional Health Authority, funded by that RHA, which made available other services, grants and jobs. It yielded data on the missing elements of fertility research, birth interval dynamics such as contraceptive use, and true cohort analysis. Alone among the countries, we extended the scope of the study, designed by 5 years, thus being able to comment on earlier pre-pill barrier stages of the contraceptive revolution. We used the oversample to extend the number of respondents, but moving between the simple proportionate sample and the oversample involved complex weighting. I had the opportunity to discuss all this with Ian Diamond, a bud companion of Len Cook's, a leading statistician demographer who was also familiar with New Zealand. The funding of the survey was haphazard beyond the grants noted already. Michael Selby, Vice-Chancellor, made available some seeding funds. They were insufficient to support a project, but I felt they might make up the start of such funding. But good fortune was at hand. We had become associate members of the coterminous United Nations European Commission's multi-country study. For curious United Nations region, Canada is a member of that commission. But more importantly, we had access to the European Commission's questionnaires, methodologies, and published one of their country reports with Kim Johnson as lead author. Moreover, following World Fertility Survey protocols, we had set up a policy council to provide community inputs to major practices and progress, and this was chaired by Jocelyn Fish, formerly president of the New Zealand Council of Women. She went ahead and arranged a meeting with the then Minister of Women's Affairs and of Health. It finished with the Minister asking our Dean, Peggy Cooper-Boyden, how much money was needed. Minister Shipley then turned to officials and, with not a single caveat, told them to give us the funding as requested. This survey was highly productive, producing countless papers, theses, reports, several monographs, and a long co-authored book on the family demography of Aotearoa by Paul Dharmalingam and Janet Skeets. Now, since publishing an early paper in 1963 on when is a Māori a Māori, I'd worried about the effects of intermarriage on ethnic classification. We used the census question with a follow-up: if you have two or more ethnicities, to which of these would you accord priority? Tahu Kukatai analysed these results and launched a much wider global study on related topics. The project in the late 1990s was somewhat out of sight in New Zealand, as it came through an IUSSP technical committee under Shripad Tuljapurka. The contribution of the PSC was to edit 2 books and write a number of papers, particularly on the issue of disordered cohort effects and their policy implications. Migration flows, incidentally, are very subject to disordered effects, making problematic planning analyses that integrate migration data. Project 4 in the early 2000s attempted to address a very important question: the links between mortality and morbidity. This topic was gaining importance in New Zealand and overseas and at a high academic level. Think of Joseph Stiglitz and Angus Deaton, who see health as central to all development and not just a demand-side variable. It had formulated a new methodology, health expectancies, and this was applied by Martin Tobias and others in the Ministry of Health to New Zealand data and then to a true New Zealand cohort. This significantly expanded our understanding of mortality-morbidity relations. With Jit Chung, we formulated an extension of health expectancies, which we called hospital utilization expectancies based on discharge data. They are based on point prevalence of day-stay data. Now, conventionally, health economics is based on monetized data, often converted from physical and human capital. But a brief reflection would show that monetized data are highly volatile and unreliable. No adjustments can really ultimately overcome these problems. By contrast, a day's stay in hospital is a much more stable material variable. But whether hospitalization took the form of the 1919 flu or COVID-19, a bed is a bed, a meal is a meal, etc., whereas values vary. This project's main contribution was for Gary Jackson and me to present a paper on it at every North Island teaching hospital and the Ministry of Health. The project also published a monograph and several papers. The final project owes its success and productivity to Sandra Baxendine. She carried out a statistical analysis and wrote up the results of regional differences in population, both for demographic measures and for other factors such as social welfare, and prison musters. No monograph has been derived from this, although Baxendine co-authored 12 discussion papers, so the results are on public record. More importantly, she dissected every single variable, census or other, for looking for problems. These analyses should be required reading for everyone using these data. I quote from her results widely in my recently completed book. I finished my presentation by previewing a successful future for NIDEA. If this commentary has any central message, it is that project orientation will strengthen production. Production is the best way to enhance the profile of NIDEA nationally and internationally as the only academic population centre in New Zealand. I look forward to NIDEA being the go-to centre for people explaining about demographic issues. Finally, we are a multicultural society. It is NIDEA's duty to ensure that the contribution of each main culture receives recognition about its contribution to the peopling and development of Aotearoa. Thank you.